Welcome, everybody, to the Story Cafe podcast, a podcast about our shared lived experiences, and a reminder that although we are unique, we do share a lot of the same experiences and the same challenges. And that's why we're here, to share about that. So today's episode is all about perfection. And I'm actually sitting in a dorm room right now, recording this because I'm at university for a couple weeks this summer. And super excited to be doing that, but also feel like I'm trying really hard not to be too loud because I'm nervous people around me are going to hear me. Although I don't think that's probably realistic. But if it feels a little bit like I'm whispering, it's because I am. So today's episode is all about perfection and perfectionism. It's about the kind of perfectionism that has the potential to really take over someone's kind of life and their mental health. And I was inspired to create this when I was listening to someone else on a podcast talk about perfection. And I posted something on my Facebook page about maybe doing an episode on perfection. And it garnered a lot of responses. Like a lot of people kind of piped up that that was something that they experienced. So I thought I would dive into that. And so I am not someone who by nature is a perfectionist. So I'm coming at this podcast with an outside view, not an inside experience. A lot of times my podcasts are about my personal experience, and I am going to share a little bit of like one tiny aspect of my life where perfectionism shows up, but really it's not what I experience. But I definitely have friends and family, and I've worked with a lot of young people who wrestle with perfectionism. And I even, at this point, I have a child, I think, that is wrestling with that. So that's why I thought I would dive into this episode. So in order to do that, because I feel like I'm coming at this with an outside view, I did a little bit of research coming into this. I wanted to do a little bit of digging about like what others have said, just to make sure that I was doing this episode of service. So first I went and looked for like what is an actual definition of perfectionism. And so Anxiety Canada, and I will say I looked at a bunch of different definitions, and to be honest, most of them were really, really similar. So this is just the one I picked. But Anxiety Canada defines perfectionism as a tendency to set standards that are so high they can either not be met or are only met with great difficulty. Perfectionists tend to believe that anything short of perfection is horrible, and that even minor imperfections will lead to catastrophe. And ultimately, most of the definitions are really similar. It's this standard for which is almost impossible to meet, and then people have a lot of emotional responses to not being able to meet that standard. And so I thought that was really interesting. I am someone who, in lots of situations, I'm really, really comfortable with failure, and I'm really, really comfortable with trying things out and seeing what happens. I actually remember a number of years ago, my husband and I built a deck because we had a yurt. And there's a whole, like anyone who's listening who knows how to build things knows there's a whole like process you use to make something square. And we tried really hard to make it square, but we probably skipped some steps. So in the end, we had a not quite square deck, and we had a friend of ours come and help us with it. And when he arrived, he took one look at it and was like, basically, that's not square. We should fix that. And I was like, it's fine. And I could see him like stress out about it. So it's not generally, in most aspects of my life, my kind of nature to be really focused on getting things perfect. So I looked up a little bit more, and of course, if you've been listening for a while, you know I love Brene Brown. So I went to find out what she says about perfection. And Brene Brown says, when perfectionism is driving, shame is always riding shotgun, and fear is the annoying backseat driver. If I am perfect, I can avoid criticism and ridicule. So I'll read that one more time. When perfectionism is driving, shame is always riding shotgun, and fear is the annoying backseat driver. If I'm perfect, I can avoid criticism and ridicule. Ultimately, what she's saying is perfectionism is a tool that we have to limit our vulnerability. It's a way of being that tries to protect us from what others might think. And I would guess our own kind of worst thoughts about ourselves. So it's like protecting ourselves from others, but also protecting ourselves from ourselves. And it's funny because the word perfection is a bit misleading. I mean, what is wrong with aspiring to be the best, right? What's wrong with aspiring to create the best things or produce the best results? And it's a word that almost seems positive, right? And I think in many aspects of our society, we actually promote this idea of best, which becomes synonymous with perfect, even though our best effort may not be perfect. We kind of sometimes use that interchangeably, which is really fascinating. And it's a bit like when I think about perfection and when I've heard people talk about it and I've seen people struggle with it, it's like a finish line that keeps moving. So you keep thinking you're at the end and you're going to, hit that mark and it moves. I've watched people freeze in fear of failure and be unable to try something. And they end up missing out because they're scared that if they don't get it perfectly, that someone will judge them or they'll judge themselves. And so they end up missing out on things. I've also seen people complete a task all the while their thoughts and words circle around how terrible they are. So they may be doing the thing that they're scared to do, but the whole time they're doing it, they are thinking and feeling and saying bad things about themselves. And both these examples take a real toll on people's emotional health. And I know I've seen that with people I'm really close with, right? I've seen that emotional toll that perfectionism has on people. And so I wanted to do this episode because I want to draw some attention to it. So for me, the closest experience I have had to perfectionism is in one aspect of my life, which is time. So to be more precise, being on time. Now, anyone who's known me for a very long time might be chuckling right now because they know this about me. But historically, I have been hyper-focused on time. I was born on my due date and have consistently walked through the world anxious about being on time. I have a pretty strong internal clock. So I generally know if I'm going to leave the house and these are the 6 things I need to do before I leave the house, how much time I need to get those things done and how to allot time. I know if I'm in the shower, how long I've been in the shower without a watch. I just have this really strong internal clock. And I believe in being slightly early, but not too early. And if you're too early, which you should be too early so that you're not late, you should, just say you're going to a meeting, you should hang out in a store, sit in a coffee shop, sit in your car. You should never arrive at your place too early, but you should always arrive a little bit early, and you should never arrive late. That is how my mind has worked my whole life. And I saw this as a superpower, right? And I had a lot of judgment about people who were late. I believed that being on time meant I was respectful, that I cared about the other person, and that clearly lateness meant the opposite, which I have changed my value around that. But if I'm being completely honest, and I've had discussions with people about this, if you are on time, that is a sign of respect. And that stuck with me. Therefore, the opposite is if I'm late, then I'm not being respectful. And I wanted to share this honestly because it was, I shouldn't say was, it's still there, but it is different in my life now, but it has been such a core part of me my whole life. And I just thought that being on time meant that I cared, and I never really dug much into what might be underneath that besides that. I just thought it was the right thing to do. The real reality is that for me, it's a bit more complex, When I was a kid, if I was going to be late for school, I would just refuse to go. I would rather not go to school than be late, because what does being late say about me? I've always been someone you could depend on to be on time. I pride myself on it. It's really important to me. But later in life, when I started to really pull it apart, and when I had to really come to terms with being late, because there's lots of reasons that people are late, I had to look at that a little bit more deeply. If I was going on a bus to, say, like a dentist appointment, and the bus got stuck in traffic, I would literally sit in that bus and start to panic, right? What am I going to do? I'm going to be late. What are they going to think? What's going to happen? Are they going to be angry at me? But in real life, there's so many things that are out of our control. The big thing that shifted in my own life was having children, because it really cracked open those values and really forced me to look at what values I had attached to being on time. And so I had to change that. I had to change how I thought about that, because once you have kids or pets or other responsibilities, there's so many things that can go wrong. So no matter how much I planned and prepped, if you had a diaper blowout 5 minutes before you leave, you're going to be late, right? If someone bonks their knee on the way out the door and you need to sit, you need to get them a Band-Aid, you need to cuddle with them, you're going to be late. And that stress I would have, that would spill out on all the people around me, including my kids. And so I had to really make a shift there. But that is kind of the closest I've experienced to perfectionism, is that need to be on time. Because if I'm not on time, what does that say about me? I think historically, it says I'm irresponsible, means I'm not thoughtful, it means I don't care. It could mean that I might get in trouble, someone might be angry at me. And that, like coming back to Brene Brown's quote, it's that being on time was a way of protecting myself from things, anger, frustration of other people. But besides that is the one area that I really get fixated. Besides that, I'm not generally a perfectionist. I'm quite comfortable with making mistakes. I'm quite comfortable with things not being perfect. But in thinking through this podcast and wanting to kind of think about what is this like for others, the time experience is the one I can start to imagine what it's like when that shows up in a lot of different places in people's lives. I think perfectionism is a spectrum, like everything. And I imagine for many people, we can find one aspect of our life where we get really hyper-focused on getting it right. But then for a lot of people, it's a lot of aspects of their life. I've seen that with parenting. I've met people who, because of their own life experiences and their desire to be different than their own parents, get really focused on doing it right. And the reality is, there's no way to do it perfectly, because humans aren't perfect and kids are complicated. Humans are complicated. So I know that for some people it really does become I don't know, but what is the right word I'm trying to say? Overwhelming. I think for some people it becomes really overwhelming. And I can see, so from an outside view with a smallish experience with perfectionism, this is what I think that experience is like in a bigger way. So if I have a lot of perfectionist tendencies, then there's this value or belief, whether I want it or not, that if I work to be perfect, then I'll never face the judgment of others, and I'll never face the judgment of myself. I won't have to confront my own inner judgment. For me, if I was on time, then no one was going to judge me for being late. But when you are someone who struggles with perfectionism in that way, it becomes, if it's a lot of aspects of your life, then you're constantly in that kind of place of fear. And the challenge with the spiral of thought and behavior is that perfection is unreachable most of the time. And the feelings and thoughts that people experience in failing to reach this impossible bar, I kind of imagine it a bit like a prison. We are our own worst critics, and we ask ourselves, are we good enough? What if I fail? What if I hurt someone? And I think those perfectionist tendencies lock people into a prison. I've watched young people stare at a test, unable to do it for fear that they'll do it wrong and take a 0. So instead of just trying and getting some wrong and some right, they'll get all of them. They'll just take a 0 because they become so locked in that prison of fear. I've watched my own child punish herself for not reaching a level of skill most adults don't have, because it might be criticized by others. Someone else might judge me for not being good enough, which tethers into my own feelings about not being good enough, right? I've also seen no amount of reassurance from an outside person really make a dent in that armor, and that's really hard. Like, if you're with someone you care about and you love and you want to support, and you're trying your best to tell them it's okay and it looks great or it's perfect exactly as it is. See how I even used perfect exactly as it is, which is like, it's not perfect. That's the reality. As I say it, when we create something, if I create a cupcake with some icing on it, it's not going to be perfect. And yet, as a parent, I might say to my kid, oh, it's perfect exactly as it is. And that is in contradiction to what they're striving for, because they're striving for a perfect that has no mistake. Nothing is wrong with it. Whereas I'm suggesting that perfect is full of mistakes. Anyway, a little aha moment there as I recorded. But I think that's why perfectionism is and can be, for some people, a prison, because people become locked in kind of thought and action cycles that leave them feeling trapped and overwhelmed. And I'm not 100% certain on the next thing I'm about to say, but I do think in most cases that the only person that can break someone out of that prison is themselves. There's no amount of me telling someone that they're great or they're awesome or they're fine that unlocks that door for them. And I think that's really, really scary. I think it's probably a really scary place when you're stuck in this thought cycle and you have to be the one to pull yourself out. And I don't want to paint like this dire end of world picture here, but I wanted to make a real effort to try to showcase what that experience is like for people based on how I see it, based on what I've seen, but not being the expert. I am by no means an expert on perfection. I'm in fact not an expert on much, but I'm definitely not an expert on that. But I wanted to showcase what I think that experience is like for people in an effort not to critique it, but to shed light on the mountain that people are climbing. Perfectionism is often hidden, and I think a pretty lonely place at times. And it can be really easy for a person like me, who in most aspects of my life doesn't really have those tendencies, to say to someone, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. Or it's okay if it doesn't work out. It's okay if there's mistakes. We'll fix them later. I have said all of these things to people, right? I have said all of these things to friends or family or colleagues. And in my mind, that's how I feel. it'll be fine. It's not a big deal if something has some mistakes in it. And it's taken me a long time to realize that me being laissez-faire about that for people doesn't help them, and it doesn't see them. I can think of moments in my nonprofit life where in a leadership role, we were trying and experimenting with some different things. And for me, innovation comes from experimentation. So if we're trying to figure out what's going on with a program and we want to make it better, I'm like, well, let's experiment a little bit. Let's try some things out and see what happens. And some things are not going to work and some things are going to work. And I believe in that. And I think that is a good frame of mind to make improvements. I think that is where innovation comes from. And I think innovation comes from the potential of failure and trying some things that may be really different. And at the time, I didn't understand how scary that would be for some people that I worked with. And I can remember the looks on people's faces when I explained, we're going to do this thing and we're all going to try out some different things. And some of those things are going to fail. And then we'll, at the end, look at it and see what worked and what didn't. And then we'll make something really great. We'll take the bits that worked, we'll learn from the failures, and then we'll create something even better. And I can remember the looks on people's faces and the questions people had that were like, but what, I don't understand. Like, what do you mean we're just going to try some things and some things aren't going to work? And how I would handle that today is not how I handled it back then. Because back then I didn't understand. And when you know better, you should do better. Back then, I didn't understand, why wouldn't everyone be okay with someone in a leadership position saying it's okay to fail? And what I realized is that me saying that it's okay to fail was not them being able to accept it's okay to fail. And so I needed to do something different to better support people to step into that vulnerable place. And that's a learning that I've had. And so for me, this podcast is not about critiquing perfectionism. We all have our mountains to climb, right? All of us. I'm going to do a whole episode on the secret thoughts at the back of your head, which are those kind of negative thought cycles we get into. And that's one of my mountains that I need to climb. And we all have our mountains to climb. And for some people, that's perfectionism. So I'm going to pause for a second. I'm actually in a dorm. I said that earlier. And I think someone's taking a phone call out in the hallway. So that might pick up on the microphone, and that's okay because that's life. So we all have our mountains to climb. And I think for some people, that's perfectionism. And so as a leader, looking back and moving forward, will do things differently to encourage and support people to step into that place where it's okay to fail. And I also think in many respects, people can pull out of that the strength in wanting to do a good job, right? I think there's value in aspiring to do your best job. And for everybody, that's a little bit different. So I have changed how I think about perfectionism. I have changed how I think about the words that I use. So in the past, I might have been like, it's fine, we're going to fail. Don't worry about it. I don't say that anymore as much as possible because that's not really sensitive to other people's experiences. And instead, I might say, yeah, we're going to try something and it might not work. And let's talk about what that might feel like, right? That might feel kind of scary and overwhelming. Well, let's talk about like what might happen if we fail. What would that look like? Especially with the young people. The role I'm in now, I'm not coaching and working with a lot of adults, but with young people, helping them go like, oh, that might be really scary. Okay, well, what would be scary about that? Well, someone might judge me. Okay, what might they judge you about and how might we work through that? And if you're close enough to someone, you could probably ask them to go a little bit deeper, which is like, how might you judge yourself? Because a lot of times I think that's what's underneath, is what we feel about ourselves and needing to shift and change how we talk to ourselves, how we respond to ourselves. And that's the part about having that key to get out of that prison, is having the ability to notice when you are in that prison where you're frozen or you're not having a positive experience, and finding a way to pull yourself out. One of the things I think is really amazing about the human experience is that our experiences and our feelings and how we think about those experiences, it's not carved in stone, right? It's not set for life. So our history, our personality, our current reality all impact how we feel about a situation. It impacts our thoughts. It impacts our feelings. But we can have new experiences, right? We can have new experiences that prove a counterpoint to those old experiences. We can create new stories. We can practice and train ourselves to think differently, to respond differently. There's a lot of room to shift and change. So perfectionism may be a prison for some people, but it can also be something you set yourself free from. It can also be something that you grow through, and it could be that mountain you climb and you gain more of a handle on it. And it can be a thing that motivates you, but that doesn't consume you. It could be the thing that teaches you about radical acceptance, right? So I do think this podcast and every podcast I've done so far is so much about that, right? I reached out recently to some listeners to say, what is this podcast even about? And across the board, people all said it's really about sharing the human experience in a way that helps people feel not so alone in it all. And that's really why I started it, because sometimes I feel alone in my own experiences, and realizing that we are unique, we're all different, but we share so much. And sometimes because of how we live, we don't know that we're all having a similar experience with something. We're not learning about each other in the same way that maybe we did hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so that's the thing that I wanted to share in this podcast about perfection, is that it is a thing that people struggle with. And it is a thing that we can overcome, whether it's the little tiny piece of your life where perfectionism shows up, or the lot of pieces in your life where perfectionism shows up. So I wanted to round off this podcast by doing something a little bit different. I wanted to invite your stories on how you tackle perfectionism. What have you learned? How have you overcome that struggle? Because although my little time example, I've kind of been thrust into shifting and changing how I feel about that, it really doesn't do justice to how people have overcome perfectionism in a bigger way. And I don't know if any of you will be willing to do this, but I would love to hear your stories. I'd love to hear what you've learned, how you've overcome, or how you've learned to kind of wrangle that perfectionism tendency. What wisdom could you share with other people? I love telling stories, and the stories I have are of my own experience, but I don't have the same experience as everyone else. So I was really hoping that at least a couple of you would send me some of your stories that I could read on the podcast. So there's going to be a perfectionism part 2, and hopefully I'll have some listener stories. They'll all be anonymous. So I'm not going to share any names or identifying details, because all I know is what I know. But collectively, we can share our own successes and challenges and help each other learn. So if you want to anonymously share your stories with listeners, you can email them to storycafepodcast@gmail.com. And I'm going to post this on my Facebook page as well. But storycafepodcast@gmail.com. And I will read them on Perfectionism episode 2. Thank you so much for showing up over and over again. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye for now.